Hey there, macro folks. This is Mr. Hooker, monetary policy video number 2. So let's go. Looking at long term interest rates. Uncle Sam wants you to buy bonds. Still today, yeah. So rates on bonds or loans that mature years out are a lot different than short term rates because they basically reflect expected future monetary policy, which depends in large part on the future economic outlook. For example, uh, if we expect interest rates to rise in the future, I don't want to get locked in today on a low yield bond, right? Or any low yield investment. I would like to go short term. And so maybe I go short term and maybe that's low yield. That way, in the future, when it's high yield, I can get into that high yield investment. That's the thing I'm looking at with that. So we basically got two things to look at the way this is. Kind of just like fiscal policy, I've got two types of monetary policy. I've got expansionary monetary policy and I've got contractionary monetary policy. So expansionary monetary policy is monetary policy that increases aggregate demand, sometimes called loose monetary policy. So my goal here is to put money in people's pockets, right? Contractionary monetary policy is the monetary policy that reduces aggregate demand, also known as tight monetary policy. And that's the one where I'm trying to get people to stop spending money. Like, hey, please quit. Just just don't. So what does it look like as far as a flow? So, one, on expansionary, we increase the money supply. That lowers the interest rates. Higher investment spending raises incomes. Then consumer spending goes up via the multiplier, and aggregate demand shifts right. If we go contractionary, we decrease the money supply. Interest rates go up, investment spending goes down, incomes go down. We get lower consumer spending through the multiplier, and aggregate demand shifts left. That's basically the way this is supposed to work. All right. So if the economy is producing at a short run level of aggregate output that's less than potential output, it's most likely the Fed will engage in open market purchases of treasury bills. We want money in the banks, right? So, how does the Fed decide whether to use expansionary or contractionary monetary policy? How does it decide how much is enough? So, policymakers try to fight recessions as well as to ensure price stability. So we have low, though not zero inflation. We'll get to that here in just a minute, I promise. The actual monetary policy reflects a combination of all of these goals here. So, um, so use tracking this using the output gap and inflation. So in the left-hand panel, the federal funds rate there is in blue and the output gap is in red. So the federal funds rate usually rises when the output gap is rising and falls when the output gap is falling. And then B, you got the federal funds rate in blue and the inflation rate in what looks to be like purple. The federal funds rate tends to be high when the inflation is high and low when inflation is low. So they do kind of follow each other. And you can see there from like 2010 to 2015, the federal funds rate was zero bound. We were hitting zero. So there's the way that goes. The Taylor rule for setting monetary policy. So a couple of years ago, I went to the AEA National Conference in San Antonio, and I actually was in a session with John Taylor, and he refuses to call this the Taylor rule. He calls it the rule that we created. Because apparently it was him and some other people, but it just gets called the Taylor rule. But he continually called it that rule we created years ago. So it was kind of funny to me that he would not call it the Taylor rule. So, but it was in 1993, John Taylor proposed a simple rule for monetary policy. It was the Taylor rule. So it set the federal funds rate according to the level, excuse me, of the inflation rate and either the output gap or the unemployment rate. So basically it works like this. Federal funds target rate, which would be equal to 2.07 plus 1.28 times the inflation rate minus 1.95 times the unemployment gap. So between 1988 and 2008, the Fed actually was using the Taylor rule. They don't use it as much anymore, but they use the Taylor rule. So there you go. Um, you see how they were using the Taylor rule there. The actual federal funds rate tracked the predicted rate quite closely through the end of '08. Um, and after that, the Taylor rule called for negative interest rates, which really weren't possible. So we just kind of scrapped it. So, nah. All right. So now what we do is what we call inflation targeting. So instead of using the Taylor rule, a lot of places use inflation targeting, and we are one of those places, the US. So the central bank sets an explicit target for the inflation rate and uses monetary policy to hit that target. Um, so look at these target inflation rates of six banks. So we're all pretty much in the same rate. So some of them have a range. New Zealand and Canada have ranges 1 to 3%, Canada 1 to 3%. So New Zealand and Canada both 1 to 3. Sweden's at 2, Norway's at 2, Britain's at 2, and the US is also a 2% target. So we all basically, Sweden, Norway, Britain, and US have a 2% target. New Zealand and Canada, 1 to 3%. And what's the middle of 1 and 3? 2. So, it's kind of interesting how we're all pretty much right there in the middle. So the big difference between the two methods, targeting is forward looking and Taylor rule is backwards looking. Um, so it is adjusting policy in response to past inflation. All right. So the zero lower bound problem for interest rates is basically interest rates can't go below zero without causing a major problem. So by 2016, the Swiss equivalent of the federal funds rate was negative 0.75, and both the European Central Bank, the ECB, and the Bank of Japan also had slightly negative rates. So zero lower bound isn't an absolute, but no central bank has tried to push rates significantly below zero. So running up against zero bound, the zero bound problem, it basically looks like this. When inflation's low and the economy is below potential, normal monetary policy runs out of room to operate because short term interest rates are already at or near zero. In November of 2010, interest rates were at or near zero, and the Fed got creative and tried what we called quantitative easing by buying longer term government bonds. Um, and despite our efforts, the pace remained painstakingly slow. For anybody that was around at that time, you know that we really didn't feel recovery until basically 2013. So people didn't realize, hey, they said the recession lasted 2007 to 2009. People didn't feel the recovery until 2013. Yeah. Technically, the math said we were out in 2009, but nobody knew we were out until 2013. That's how bad that was. All right, so we're not drawing anything right now. All right, what about the economy's ability to self correct through flexible wages and short run aggregate supply shifts? In the long run, changes in the quantity of money affect the price level, but not the output or interest rate. So that happens. Um, so here we go. We got the long, the money supply and the money demand here. Money supply moves to the right. Increase in money supply lowers the interest rate. Money demand moves, but the long run higher prices lead to greater money demand, raising the interest rate back to its original level, and you just end up right where you were. So in the long run, those changes to the money supply don't affect the interest rate much. This is money neutrality. Money, change in the money supply don't have no real effect on the economy. That's us. And that's the end today. So we will see you in the next chapter, chapter 16. Everybody take